the students.
By the students. This is Ford Radio.
Your university soundtrack.
Hello and welcome to LifePod. I'm Harry Browse, and this week we're taking a trip down memory lane with activist, columnist and drag artist Heather Paterson and discovering Sheffield's forgotten LGBTQ nightlife. We'll be discussing identity, culture and all things radically fabulous. Hi Heather, how are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to say congratulations for being nominated for a National Diversity Award. So could you tell me a little bit about that?
There's awards that have been running for quite a few years now, I think since 2014, that recognise people and organisations in all different categories. So people that are doing work for LGBT, for disability, for gender, for age, and they have individual community activists, celebrities, companies and organisations. So yes, I've just found out yesterday I've been nominated for one of them, which is quite exciting.
Oh, that's fantastic. Could you tell me a little bit more about the work that you've been doing in terms of LGBT representation and activism?
So at the moment, I work for volunteer with the Sheffield Equality Hub Network. So I chair the LGBT hub of that. And I also write the LGBT plus column for Expose magazine, so just promoting what's happening locally. And I help out once a month with LAS, which is the Lesbian Asylum Support group. I'm going to be working full-time in the LGBT sector in a few weeks. But before that, back in the day, I was LGB officer at Hallam, almost 20 years ago now. I worked with the LGBT Youth Initiative. I've guest hosted when there used to be an LGBT hour on Sheffield Live. I've done quite a lot around sort of art scene as well, so I sort of DJ and do drag and compare events and stuff as well. So yeah, I'm generally fairly busy.
You sound it. So our feature for this issue is all about confidence, and I know for LGBTQ people, it can be really hard to sort of express yourself in society. I don't know whether you had any thoughts about sort of, especially in the work that you've done, in terms of self-confidence and identity and that relation to sort of...
I think I've probably been quite fortunate in that. It's certainly sort of in my adult life. I did a bit of a coming out with a bang when I came to Sheffield. So I wasn't out when I was in Liverpool and I came here for uni. And all those thoughts that you have in your head of everyone that you've known since childhood, what if they take it wrong, they don't want to ever speak to you again. And so I decided moving to Sheffield, not knowing anyone here already. This is obviously back in 99, 20 years ago. I was like, everyone I meet from day one, like I meet as a gay woman. And then if they've got a problem with it, it doesn't matter because I don't know them. So I did pretty much sort of as an overexcited 18-year-old just sort of run around, hi, I'm Heather, I'm a lesbian. So it wasn't... I suppose it's one way of doing it. But for me, that worked. And in the lines of work that I've worked in, obviously on the LGBT side, it's absolutely not an issue, it's a positive side. But my day job, historically, I used to work in sort of engineering and construction industry, which is very male-dominated. And there was almost, as problematic as it is, you were viewed a bit more as one of the lads. So it kind of went in your favour in probably quite a wrong way, but day to day, it wasn't like, I think sort of, traditionally women aren't well represented. And being considered one of the lads rather than as a woman deserving of respect in your own right isn't necessarily the best way to go about it, but it makes life easier, I think. So, I've not had sort of bad experiences in Sheffield, really, with that.
So you mentioned coming to Sheffield in 1999. How was Sheffield then in terms of acceptance? Because I think one of those things about Sheffield is that it's a really open... I've found it quite accepting and tolerant. What was it like back then? Was it different to how it is now, or...?
Yeah, I think Sheffield's always been a sort of friendly, lefty, liberal sort of city where folk get on. I mean, in terms of the scene's changed a lot. When I first went out back to the Cossack, which isn't there anymore, sadly, that was your only sort of city centre bar, and everything else was sort of shoved out of the way in Attercliffe. which again, there was a good sort of scene. There were a few bars you could do a bit of a pub crawl, and everyone knew each other, and it was really friendly. But on the flip side of that, you were shoved out onto an industrial estate in Attercliffe, and you weren't necessarily, as a scene, part of what was going on in the centre of town. So yeah, it was friendly, but it wasn't. Again, there's always sort of good and bad in everything. But it was welcoming enough for me to stick around and still be here 20 years later.
That's the thing. I think Sheffield's got one of those strange relationships with, especially an LGBT scene. So at the moment, there's the new gay quarter, which is at the bottom of the moor. But it, as you say, it's changed since over the years. So what kind of places do you remember from when you was a student at Hallam?
So, I mean, obviously I've already mentioned Cossack.
Yeah.
That was your sort of staple where you started the night. Out at Attercliffe, you had Madison's, Barcelona. I just caught the back end of the Albert Planet, which was our sort of club, and Excess, which was the sort of predating Dempsey's, was your place where you could drink till 6 in the morning if you so wanted to. So, for obvious reasons, memories of that venue is a little hazy.
Don't blame you. The scene back then, did it encounter difficulties as it tends to do? Like,
I think you maybe had a bit of a flip side. I know we look back at stuff with rose tinted glasses, but because it was a lot smaller than in terms of the total number of people, we all knew each other. Like, everyone knew each other. You never bothered making arrangements for a nice house, because you go down to the Cossack and maybe 50 out of the total 200 people that actually went on the scene were out, so there'd always be people in who you knew to have a chat to. Whereas now, if you just sort of randomly turned up to a bar on your own, not knowing anyone, the likelihood of you sort of knowing other people there, you wouldn't necessarily guarantee it. So I think it had the sort of Sheffield village type feel to it. For what is a fairly large city, it had that local community feel to it, which I think was quite nice. But again, it had that because there's 60,000 LGBT people in the city. If only 200 of them were out and visible, then that was an issue in itself. So it felt nice, it felt friendly, but obviously it wasn't, for whatever reason, welcoming or accessible or wanting to be accessed by everyone.
What ways do you think that your time in Sheffield kind of nurtured how many things you do in the LGBT community in your day-to-day life now? Because you do so much, like you're a writer, columnist, there's lots of things that you do. How much of that was born in Sheffield? Or
it was all born in Sheffield because it all happened here. This is where I lived. But I think in terms of the time, was really good. So I turned 18. I got elected onto the committee at Hallam Union, and the first organised trip that I did was the last ever Section 28 march. The second one that I did was the last ever Equal Age of Consent march. So you kind of were just ignored everything that had happened for decades before, and were just clearly all they were waiting for was for us to turn up, which obviously wasn't the case. But I think it was the perfect year to start in LGBT activism, because you got to see that things can be won. I think a lot of time you get sort of activist burnout, and if you constantly sort of feel like you're fighting a battle that you're never going to win, whereas I had that sort of year 1, year 2, saw those wins and saw that actually these are things that we can achieve. So I think that was probably one of the sort of big motivators for me to still be doing stuff, because you don't get that every year, or every 5 years, 10 years even. So I think it was, and I think that's probably similar, that there's a few people that I know that were kicking around at that time that are also still active and still doing stuff now as well.
Oh, that's brilliant.
So I think it probably had that effect on not just myself.
For listeners who probably don't know what Section 28 is, could you give a little brief? It's a bit of a complicated, but from your experience, what was your activism against?
So Section 28 was, or Clause 28 was a little section in the law that said that you couldn't promote homosexuality as a lifestyle or family life above a traditional family. So it's a bit awkwardly worded, because actually what we're saying is you know, technically the law just said that you couldn't promote it ahead of, but the actual effect of that was that LGBT issues were not mentioned at school. So you would go through your entire education with just gay people or LGBT people, no mention that they even existed. And for people working in education, teachers who just were too fearful of ever being out because of impacts of that on their careers. So it was a fairly major thing. So we're having lots of discussion now about the new SRE curriculum and including LGBT in that. And that's a long way from, like, say, 20 years ago, when you couldn't even mention that, you know, that gay people existed.
That's the thing. There was a lot of controversy recently. I think it was a school in
Birmingham.
School in Birmingham, where there's a teacher who promoted an initiative to help equalise the representation of LGBT partnerships and relationships, and then I think it was a predominantly Muslim school. I think there was a lot of teachers that had and it conflicted with religious teaching, so therefore the programme got shut down. What's the centre of your activism at the moment, I suppose? Is it to do with any of that, or is there...
So I've been involved in a little bit of the SRE and curriculum stuff, and I think that's maybe something that, looking ahead of some of the stuff I've got planned for the future, will be something that I'll maybe be a little bit more involved in. A lot around trans inclusion has been a big focus at the moment. It's difficult because you tend to have to be responsive, so your activism is led on, well, which of us are currently being attacked the most, which is rubbish, really, but it is the way that it kind of works. And you know, I think across the board, not just with LGBT, we live in quite divisive times at the moment. I think we've had a lot of years where sort of equality's been making a lot of strides forward, but then over the past few years, not just in Sheffield or even across the country, but globally, you've got your Trumps and your Putins, you've got Brexit, you've got all this sort of stuff. All of those type of attitudes and politics are trying to divide us. And I think for all of the positives that we've taken over the years, the past sort of 2 years or so, we're seeing a rollback of that. And it's a lot easier to lose rights than it is to gain them in the first place. So there's things that we might have been fighting for decades can be taken away with almost a click of the fingers. So I think not just looking for sort of what more do you want, what do we need to do next, but actually fighting to keep hold of what we already have in terms of rights and equality, I think is really important as well.
I think that, I completely agree. I think it goes back to this idea of identity and self-expression, which I think is quite political in itself. Like, for example, I have been shouted at cars by men because I've been wearing something that's quite doesn't fit kind of like a heteronormative like kind of ideal. But then I think that's also quite thought-provoking for me if I do get shouted at, because it shows that I'm stirring something. My presence is somewhat threatening, which I find quite fun. But I don't know what you thought about this idea of visibility as a political act, as something, as identity expression, as something which is revolutionary.
I think it is to an extent, and I mean, you're preaching to the converse as someone who's sort of trolled through Rotherham bus station in full drag on several occasions. Kind of used to that, but I think it's kind of a privileged position to take. I'm in a position where I can be visible and I have support and family and friends. It's not going to affect my work. I don't have those other barriers in place, so I can sort of be as visible as I want. Not everyone has that sort of luxury, and I think as well, depending on what the climate is at the time, visibility can equally be, not that you should ever have to hide yourself, but it can be equally dangerous. So in a lot of the sort of transphobic media that we're seeing at the moment, I can understand why people don't feel able to be visible. You know, there's a lot that, you know, where people's safety has remained on sort of going under the right radar and just quietly living their lives and actually not having that attention focused on them. So I think it's important to get the balance of that and to realise, if you have that privilege of being visible and you choose to use that to be political and to make that statement, then that's great, all power to you. But equally, people shouldn't be demonized because they can't or choose not to. So it's a bit of a sort of double-edged sword, I think. I spend the majority of my life living in this sort of nice little comfortable queer bubble, and we joke sometimes, like just with my friends and that, and like that, I forget straight people exist sometimes because I spend, and obviously for me that's my entire sort of work, social life, everything sort of is in that sort of sector. So you can sort of cut yourself off of it as well and sort of go, actually, is this the tone of the sort of wider community? How sort of acceptable is it? What's like an outside response to sort of what's going on here? Because when you spend sort of your life in that sort of activist or LGBT bubble, it can be difficult to see that sort of bigger picture. But again, it's something, and I think that's again something that people do for safety in the same way as like when we mentioned the sort of the actual sort of commercial scene, which obviously the LGBT community is far more than a group of pubs.
Yes,
but historically, the reason that most gay villages and gay scenes exist is because people have gone there as a sort of place of safety.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think it all links in together.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what's so important about LGBT spaces that operate during the day as well. I think because it means that some people have a lot of places, like a variety of places to go to find safety. And I think that's quite what's nice about this safe space kind of movement that's been quite popular and has been quite stigmatized by media as well. But I think they offer a nice refuge during the day, because not everyone, because as you say, nightlife used to be like the place of refuge for gay people, a place of safety as a safe space where you're accepted for who you are.
But then equally, that probably feeds into the reasons that we have much higher rates of alcohol and substance misuse in the LGBT community. We have much higher rates of mental health issues, because, when I was 15 years old, I wasn't going, down to the bowling alley. I was sneaking underage into the local gay bar. And because that was where, my community was. And, I think that definitely has an impact, or it can have an impact. And I think that's something that we're moving forward with really well in Sheffield at the moment. We've got a regular pop-up LGBT cafe that runs at the moment. We've got quite a few sort of social and support groups that sort of alcohol-free spaces. We've got people like Eden who do film stuff. They do the Transforming Cinema. Andrew and Eve do sort of drag cabaret stuff that's going to do really inclusive events that I think they do have a bar there, but they're not particularly alcohol-focused. I don't know if it's public yet, but there is going to be some 50-plus stuff happening. That I know a local organisation's just got some funding for, so they're going to start doing some older people's LGBT stuff. So there's going to be some more social activities there. So we're not necessarily at the forefront when you think of maybe places like Manchester or London who have sort of full-time community centres and stuff. But I think, we're quite good at creating our own spaces in Sheffield. We're quite good at, we haven't had that big sort of village like Manchester has. But then you'll turn around and go, there's stuff happening at the Moor Deli, and then there's something else at Dina, and then, this place is doing a film screen, and then somewhere else. So there's loads of, it takes a little bit more digging out. But I think it's a lot more DIY, and I think I'd really like that because it feels like, people are putting on what they want to see themselves rather than going, well, here's your sort of village, take it or leave it. So I like that feel, and it feels a very Sheffield way of doing things.
Definitely. And I kind of agree. It kind of resists that sort of commercialism that often accompanies LGBT spaces as well. So there's that there's a critique of recent Manchester Pride, which tickets are now going up for 30, I think it's something like £35 for a ticket to attend a Pride festival, and they've branded it as a festival. I don't know whether you had any thoughts about this kind of like the commercialisation of this movement and this event, which is often, it started out as a protest. It started out from the Stonewall riots. After that there was the Pride events, and I wondered what you thought about those.
I think for me, I mean, obviously historically I was involved. I was one of the co-founders of Sheffield Pride a number of years ago, although it's not something that I'm involved in these days. But my aim was that the event should always be accessible, and that included being free, so that people weren't financially excluded. And I think if you completely try and strip the politics away, then it's not Pride anymore. It's just a music festival, which is fine if that's what you want to do. I've had some great times. I've gone down to like Big Gay House in London and paid far too much for my tickets and screamed at Kylie Minogue, and that's fine. But there was nothing necessarily political about that, and it wasn't. You know, for my mind, it was a great pop concert. It wasn't, but that's what it was. It wasn't a political event. I think it's difficult when. I think the likes of Manchester probably get away with it more because of the scale. So the last time I went to Manchester Pride, I did the parade pass, which is always free.
Yeah, it's always free,
and then they actually had an event down at Manchester Mess as like an alt Pride. And I went there because it was free, it was where my mates were going, and I preferred the acts, and I didn't want to get crushed in the village because it was just, I'm not great with huge crowds, so actually it was just a friendlier place for me, and because of the size of Manchester, it kind of because that's at the core, it supports all these sorts of, there's lots of DIY arts and sort of cool stuff happening around the fringe of that. So I think once you get past a sort of critical threshold where you can have both, so if you want to pay X amount of money and go and see like the big name pop stars, and that's what you're there for, that's great, but it's not at the expense of all the local community stuff, because that all still gets to happen as well. I think when you're in more of a sort of medium-sized place, it's one or the other. So I think we've definitely had that sort of clash in Sheffield. I think at the point that I left Pride initially, I actually left to go back to uni. Running Pride wasn't enough of a sort of stressy part-time hobby. I thought I'd do an engineering degree for laughs. So I had to knock it on the head. But the following year, the Pride committee got a lot, at that point, got a lot bigger. And what actually happened was that you had half of the committee who were sort of youth and community workers and activists and were really focused on that side, and the other half that were from the sort of bars and clubs and sort of commercial side, and they were just constantly, because they had two very different focuses. So what happened at that point was the commercial scene based people kept Pride, and the voluntary sector people set up LGBT Sheffield. So that's how LGBT Sheffield started. So rather than being constantly arguing because they have very different aims, they said, well, let's both do what we want to do, and where our area of focus is, and sort of go our separate ways. So yeah, I mean, people are always going to have different ideas with that. I think I'm always going to personally fall on my focus being on the sort of community and political side. That's where my interest is, but I'm not necessarily, if your side is doing sort of more of the bars and club stuff, then great, you do that. I think there's space for all of us.
Yeah, I really like, and it's nice when they overlap. So I'd like to talk a bit about your drag act, Anarchist.
Yeah. So that she's taken on a life of her own over recent years. Originally, she sort of developed quite organically. That back in the day, I had quite a lot of friends who did drag, and my general wardrobe has always been a bit tacky. So those sorts of two, so on that side, it kind of was just me dressing up, and I was just going clubbing. I wasn't doing anything other than just sort of having a night out. But then when I started doing the Pride stuff, obviously we were doing a lot more with sort of fundraisers and events, and quite often it would be, well, we need someone to DJ, we need someone to compare, and anything that we could get away without paying for. that was it. So it was.
Brilliant,
So
yeah.
I started doing bits with that, doing sort of fundraiser events and things. And at that point, it was DJing and the odd bit of comparing. And then people started seeing me out and about a bit more, and I think they kind of assumed that I performed.
Yeah.
Which I didn't. Like, I can't sing, I can't dance. You know, it's not really something that I do. And then there was a night that started at the deli, and I'd always fancied giving it a go. And there was this night, Cabaret Revolté, that was a drag event. Had all different acts on, but what they used to do was at the sort of half-time interval bit, every month they would have a debut act on, so someone who'd never performed in drag before. And I took one of those slots, and it was probably terrible. In fact, it was definitely terrible, but I loved it.
Oh, that's
I was
what's
like,
important.
I was so terrified, and I went on and I did my like 3-minute song, and I came off, and it was like when you get off a roller coaster. I was like, that was terrifying. I want to do it again now.
I love that.
And yeah, so I started doing bits more of that. So yeah, it's just something that I sort of do now and then on the side when I have time, which is scarce a lot of the time. But yeah, hopefully she'll be parading about, spreading glitter and joy somewhere soon.
That's what I like to hear. Heather, thank you so much. If you want any more information about what Heather's doing, you've got a website, haven't you?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just heatherpaterson.co.uk.
Fabulous. Brilliant. Thank you so much. This has been LifePod, and I'm Harry Browse. Thanks for listening.